10 to 12 hours. That is how long it took, by Third Army's own estimate, for routine information to travel from a frontline unit to the Army command post before the campaign started. 10 to 12 hours. In a mobile campaign where armored columns were moving 10 to 15 miles per day, which means every decision made at Army level was being made on a map that was already history. Now hold that number. In the first 2 weeks of August 1944, Third Army advanced nearly 400 miles, from the breakout at Avranches to the Seine River. Paris would fall before the month was out. Allied planners had estimated the German border would take the better part of a year to reach from the Normandy beaches. Third Army was there in 5 weeks. Post-war German accounts, staff reports, interviews, and operational analyses compiled after the surrender describe the experience of facing Third Army in August in terms that keep reappearing across different sources, different units, different commands. The tempo was inexplicable. The advance did not behave the way a formation of that size should behave. The response they prepared for the Third Army of Monday was obsolete by Wednesday. They were not wrong, but they were looking for an explanation in the wrong place. They looked for a secret weapon, a technological edge, overwhelming mass. Those explanations were logical. They were also incomplete. The real explanation was sitting on a field table in a requisitioned French farmhouse somewhere east of Avranches. A clipboard, half filled. A G2 memorandum measuring, in real time, the gap between what Third Army's information system was producing and what the Army commander actually needed, and the gap was being closed. Every day, faster than the German command loop could track. This episode is not really about firepower. It is about what happens when an army learns to fix itself faster than the enemy can process what it is fighting. The German army that faced Third Army in August 1944 was not a broken force. Say that clearly. The Wehrmacht in France had been bled badly in Normandy, but the professional culture that produced it, the doctrine of small unit initiative, the deep technical competence of the officer corps, the Auftragstaktik system of mission-type orders, was intact, and it was genuinely formidable. Auftragstaktik gave junior commanders freedom to act without waiting for orders to catch up to opportunity. A German battalion commander understood his commander's intent and moved without calling up the chain, without waiting for permission. It had worked in Poland, in France in 1940, in North Africa, in the early Eastern Front campaigns. It was an excellent system for a specific kind of war, a war where the problem was execution, where the plan was sound and the question was only how fast and how boldly it could be driven forward. But execution and learning are different problems. Auftragstaktik was built for the first. The German military culture that produced brilliant battlefield tacticians was also a culture where after-action analysis tended to confirm doctrine more often than challenge it, where a staff officer who told his general that the method, not the execution, the method, was producing bad results was stepping onto uncertain professional ground. The Germans were a potent force for decentralized execution. They were not built for rapid institutional self-correction. That distinction cost them France. Here is where the distinction becomes physical. Before Third Army crossed to France, its G3 operations section had measured the information lag precisely, 10 to 12 hours from frontline unit to Army command post for routine traffic. That number was treated, inside Third Army, as an enemy, not a limitation to be managed. An enemy to be destroyed. While the Germans were preparing blocking positions based on where Third Army was projected to be, and while their own information was traveling up a chain that moved at the pace of traditional staff procedure, Third Army was already building the system that would make their projections obsolete before they were acted on. The machine was not impressive on paper. It did not look like a weapon. It looked like a clipboard, a motorcycle, a radio van, and a mandate from the commanding general that one officer from every staff section would visit frontline units every single day and report directly to the chief of staff immediately upon returning. Not at the next briefing. Immediately. That is where the advantage was born. Not in a factory. In a daily habit, enforced from the top, built before the first shot was fired. The roads in northern France in August 1944 were not kind to equipment. Dust-clogged filters, heat-cracked gaskets. The SCR 399 radio sets, the backbone of Third Army's information network, had rated range limits. The August pursuit had outpaced those limits within the first week. In the gap between what the radio could reach and what the Army commander needed to know, a cavalry trooper from the 6th Cavalry Group got on a motorcycle. He was not a courier by training. He was a radio operator with 3 to 4 years of experience behind a set. He was good at his job, but his job had just changed because the radio was not working and the information in his pouch needed to reach the operations van before it became useless. He rode. A report from the front. Contact locations, prisoner counts, road conditions. What the armored spearhead had found on the other side of the next village. He was not a metaphor for the feedback loop. He was the feedback loop. One man, one motorcycle, one pouch. In the dust, at speed, on a road that may or may not have been clear. When he got back, someone in the AIS operations van, by mid-August, that van held 2 officers and 3 enlisted men, expanded from the original 1 officer and 1 enlisted man because the volume demanded it, would extract the relevant data and push it toward the G2 and G3 maps. That is what the machine looked like from the inside, not a diagram, not a doctrine slide. A man in the dust, moving information that the equipment could not carry. And when that solution, the motorcycle courier, proved insufficient for the distances involved, Third Army did not file a complaint. It built advanced signal centers along the axis of advance, at points where the distance between Army and Corps command posts exceeded 60 miles. Relay stations, standing up in the field, created from available personnel and equipment, because the feedback from the front said the existing chain was not enough, not invented after the campaign, during it. Now step back from the motorcycle and look at who built the conditions that made this possible. Patton assumed command of Third Army months before it entered France. His first actions were not about firepower or formation. They were about information flow. He mandated immediately that 1 officer from each staff section and from each subordinate corps staff would visit frontline units every single day, not weekly, not when the operational tempo allowed, every day. And upon returning, that officer would report directly to the chief of staff. Immediately, not at the next scheduled briefing. Immediately. The commanding general or the chief of staff was required to do the same. This was not a gesture toward accessibility. It was a structural decision about where information came from and how fast it had to move. It created a daily physical connection between the people making operational decisions and the units carrying those decisions out. It meant that the map in the war room was being corrected every day by someone who had been at the front that morning. Colonel Allen, who served as Deputy G2 of Third Army, later described what this produced in the headquarters itself. Groups of tankers and infantrymen, his words, with hand grenades still hanging from their lapels and the smell of the fight still on them, were a common sight in the Third Army war room. Pause on that sentence. Not in a debriefing room. not processed by clerks and filtered into a report. In the war room, where the maps were, where the decisions were being made. Allen noted specifically that this was never seen at any other Army headquarters in the theater. That detail is doing a lot of work, because a headquarters where a tanker can walk in from the front and stand next to the operations map is a headquarters where the information on that map has a shorter distance to travel from reality to decision. The tanker's picture of the road he just drove is already in the room. It does not have to be written, routed, summarized, and delivered tomorrow. It is there now. That was not an accident of Patton's personality. It was a policy he had put in place before Third Army fired a single shot in France. The war room with the tankers in it was the physical result of a mandate that had been written months earlier in England. And the formal side of that mandate was already running before the war started. The G2 section began holding planning sessions and submitting performance memoranda to the Chief of Staff within days of Third Army headquarters arriving in the United Kingdom. The first of those memoranda was presented on the 4th of April, 1944. Third Army headquarters had arrived in the United Kingdom 12 days earlier. 12 days. That is the cadence of an organization that had already decided it was behind and had no patience for the alternative. Patton believed and stated directly that the after-action report should begin being compiled at the start of operations, not the end. A group drawn from G2 and G3 should start that compilation from day one, not to document what had already happened, to measure in real time the gap between what the organization was producing and what the mission required. The clipboard on the field table was not bureaucracy. It was a weapon. If the part of this war that interests you is the hidden machinery behind the advance, the system that made the speed possible rather than just the speed itself, this is exactly where it starts. Now the Army Information Service, the AIS. There was nothing like it in standard American doctrine. It had been built from two organizations pressed together. The Signal Intelligence Service, staffed largely by civilians recruited for language and radio skills, and the 6th Cavalry Group, regular Army cavalrymen whose commander, Fickett, had specifically prioritized radio proficiency above almost everything else in the unit's pre-deployment training. Not combat maneuver. Radio proficiency. The combination was unusual by design. Patton believed that putting different kinds of expertise in direct friction with each other produced better solutions than any single professional culture could generate alone. He deployed this untested, composite, experimental organization directly into combat on the first day. Third Army became operational, the 1st of August, 1944, without knowing exactly how it would perform. That decision carried real risk. An untested intelligence architecture in a high-tempo mobile campaign with no margin for information failure measured in hours. In the first days, the AIS struggled. Operators were unfamiliar with the new radios. Equipment failed. The distances grew faster than the communications could follow. The number of information detachments increased from 13 to 15 within the first week, and the traffic from those additional detachments threatened to overwhelm a headquarters that had never been manned for that volume. The system was under stress from the first hour. What happened next is the specific thing that separates Third Army from every comparable organization in the theater. Within less than 2 weeks of entering combat, Third Army conducted a formal analysis of AIS performance. Not a general impression. Specific metrics. How fast was information moving from the front line to the G2 and G3 operations rooms? How accurate was it proving to be? And the question that changed everything, was it actually driving decision-making, or was it filling the log with noise? The SCR-399 radio sets were failing at extended range. The motorcycle couriers were carrying information. The radios could not. The monitoring mission, listening to friendly radio traffic and retransmitting it, was producing information that was incomplete, sometimes unreliable, always slower and less accurate than what a liaison officer sitting directly with a Division G2 could produce in the same time. The feedback from the field was unambiguous, so Patton's headquarters made a decision that no comparable unit in the theater had made, and that, in most military organizations, would have required months of doctrinal review. They abandoned radio monitoring entirely. By the 15th of August, less than 2 weeks into combat, the AIS stopped the monitoring mission that had been its primary function and pivoted completely to directed liaison. Human beings making direct contact with division-level staffs, gathering information face-to-face, and moving it up the chain through motorcycle couriers and relay stations. Patton later stated it directly. Monitoring produced incomplete and unreliable information that had to be confirmed by other sources anyway. It was not a satisfactory means of obtaining tactical information. For me, this is where the story stops being about hardware and becomes about something harder to name and harder to build, an organization that tells its own chain of command, 14 days into a campaign, that its primary approved mission is producing inferior results and needs to be replaced. That is not a normal military organization. That is an organization where the culture around the clipboard on the field table is strong enough to override the inertia of approved doctrine. That is the edge. By the 15th of August, 1944, Third Army had been operational for exactly 2 weeks. In those 2 weeks, nearly 400 miles, from Avranches to the Seine. 4 corps operating simultaneously in completely different mission types. Veit Corps in Brittany reducing fixed German positions, Ostpreußischen Corps blocking the German 7th Army's escape from the Falaise pocket, 5th Fall Corps and X Corps driving east toward Paris and the frontier. Let me put something side by side with that number. Before the campaign started, Third Army's own G3 operations section had estimated routine information took 10 to 12 hours to travel from a frontline unit to the Army command post. 10 to 12 hours. In a campaign where armored columns were moving 10 to 15 miles per day, that lag meant every decision at Army level was being made on a map that was already history before the ink dried. Third Army treated that number as a problem to be destroyed, not managed, destroyed. Within 2 weeks, the AIS had established advanced signal centers along the axis of advance. Motorcycle courier routes were running as redundant information spines alongside the SCR-399 radio nets. Radio procedures had been restructured so that divisional detachments reported through corps supplementary detachments before relaying to AIS headquarters, compressing the chain, cutting the delay at every junction. The operations van had grown from 1 officer and 1 enlisted man to 2 officers and 3 enlisted men, because the volume demanded it and the metrics said the original configuration was a bottleneck. None of these decisions came from a manual. They came from measuring the gap between what the clipboard on the field table was showing and what the Army commander required, and then closing that gap immediately with whatever was available, without waiting for doctrine to catch up. The Germans had no equivalent process, and here is the important thing to hold on to. This was not because German commanders were less intelligent or less professional or less experienced. The Wehrmacht's officer corps was, by almost any measure, one of the most technically proficient fighting forces in the world. Their armor doctrine had reshaped modern warfare. Their engineers, their artillerists, their signals officers, all trained to a high standard. Their small unit initiative had broken armies that fought by older rules, but the German command system was built on a different assumption about where information should flow. The assumption was that the plan, once set, was essentially correct, and that the role of the organization was to execute it with speed and initiative. Information about whether the method itself was working tended to move downward more naturally than upward. A staff officer who elevated a concern about the method, not the execution, the method, was moving against the grain of the professional culture around him. German commanders adapted constantly and often brilliantly at the tactical level. Individual units showed remarkable flexibility, but institutional self-correction, the kind that required a headquarters to formally measure its own primary mission, conclude it was producing inferior results, and replace it in the middle of a campaign, was not the natural motion of the Wehrmacht staff system. The Germans adapted to the problem they could see. The problem they could see was always the Third Army of the previous week. This is the mechanism, not firepower, not numbers alone. Time. Third Army was correcting its own system faster than the German command loop could process what it was fighting. By the time a German formation had identified a pattern in Third Army's behavior, studied it, elevated it to the appropriate command level, developed a response, and pushed that response down to the units that needed to change. Third Army had already identified the same pattern in itself, concluded it was a vulnerability or an inefficiency, and changed it. The motorcycle courier route that Third Army used on Tuesday had already been replaced by a relay station on Thursday. The radio procedure that German signals units had learned to anticipate had been restructured. The detachment composition that a German G2 had mapped was already different. Post-war German staff analyses and operational reviews describe the experience of facing Third Army in August in terms that appear consistently across multiple sources and commands. The tempo did not behave as expected for a formation of that size. Prepared responses produced diminishing results. The pattern of advance seemed to shift before the response to the previous pattern had been fully implemented. These are not the observations of commanders who failed to understand their profession. These are the observations of professional soldiers whose command system was operating on a longer correction cycle than the one they were fighting. They were solving last week's equation every time. Let's make that concrete. In mid-August, Hitler repositioned elements of Army Group G from the south to address Third Army's threat axis west of Paris. It was a rational response to a genuine operational threat, pulling forces from one front to stabilize another, based on the best available picture of where Third Army was going. By the time those elements arrived and oriented on the threat axis they had been sent to address, Third Army's 12th Corps had seized Orleans. 15th Corps was advancing east of Dreux. Gix's Corps had reached Chartres, southwest of Paris, forcing further German repositioning. The threat axis had moved. The German reinforcement was solving a problem that Third Army had already left behind. Think about what that means at the level of the individual German commander on the ground. He is dealing with his own information problems, his own radio failures, his own courier delays, his own difficulty tracking where his subordinate units actually are in the chaos of a collapsing front. These are real problems. They consume real time and real cognitive energy. While he is solving those problems, a Third Army AIS liaison officer is sitting with his opponent's division, G2, getting the picture directly, walking it to a motorcycle or a relay station, moving it toward Lucky Forward, the mobile army command post, repositioning itself every 5 days to stay close to the advance, in hours instead of half a day. The German commander's information about Third Army is old. Third Army's information about the German commander is fresh. That asymmetry, sustained across an entire month, across an entire army, across hundreds of miles of fluid front, is not luck. It is not mass. It is not a miracle. It is the SCR 399 radio that failed and got replaced by a motorcycle. It is the operations van that doubled its manning because the metrics said it was a bottleneck. It is the liaison officer sitting in a French farmhouse at midnight, writing notes by lamplight, because the clipboard on his knee is the most current picture of the front that Third Army's commander is going to have by morning. Here is a question worth sitting with, and I want your answer in the comments. Most accounts of Third Army's sweep across France point to Patton's boldness as the primary explanation. His aggression, his refusal to stop, those things are real and documented. But the records, the G3 after-action reports, the AIS performance analyses, the Signal Intelligence Service operational reviews, point to something that ran underneath the boldness and made it sustainable. A correction cycle measured in days rather than weeks. A headquarters that told itself bad news before the enemy could use it. Which factor do you think decided France, Patton's personality, or the system his headquarters built before anyone fired a shot? The records point somewhere specific. Let me know your verdict below. Part 4. The Hidden Cost. Then came the part. The clean version of the story usually leaves out. The machine almost broke. Not in a single dramatic afternoon. The way complex systems under sustained stress actually fail. Gradually at the seams, in the places no one is watching, because everyone is focused on the advance. By the 15th of August, the AIS was in serious trouble. Detachments had grown from 13 to 15 within the first week, each one generating traffic, each piece of traffic requiring reception, processing, filtering, and routing by a headquarters that had been designed for a smaller, slower, more concentrated operation. Lucky Forward was moving forward every 5 days. Every time it moved, the communications geometry changed. The Corps' command posts were spreading apart faster than the SCR 399 ground wave signal could follow. In some sectors, the sets had gone past their rated range entirely. Toward the 4th Armored Division and the 6th Armored Division, driving hard west through Brittany, AIS-directed motorcycle couriers had become the only reliable means of communication. Not a supplement, the only means. The fastest moving formations, the ones most likely to find something the Army commander needed to know about immediately, were also the hardest to reach. The information chain was thinnest exactly where the front was most fluid. This was not a design failure. It was the inevitable friction of a system being pushed past its tested limits by a campaign moving faster than anyone had projected. In a different headquarters, the response might have been consolidate. Wait for the front to stabilize. Let the information architecture catch up before pushing further. Third Army did not wait. But, and this is the part that disappears in the heroic version, it did not push blindly either. Fickett had made a specific decision before deployment. He had trained his cavalrymen for radio proficiency above almost everything else. Not mounted tactics, not combat maneuver. Radio. The ability to make a signal get through when the conditions said it should not. When the SCR 399 sets failed in the field, his men did not wait for replacement equipment or technical guidance. They knew the sets well enough to push them past rated limits. They found frequencies, angles, and timing windows the manual did not specify. They built the relay stations. They ran the courier routes. They held the chain together with 3 to 4 years of radio experience and the specific training their commander had prioritized long before anyone knew how much it would matter. One AIS member wrote after the war, that important and far-reaching decisions were being made on what a sergeant or a private saw or heard and reported. Read that twice. Not a colonel, not a formal intelligence assessment. A sergeant, a private, an enlisted cavalryman behind a radio set or on a motorcycle, generating the raw information that Army-level operational decisions were being built on. That was not an accident of circumstance. It was the direct product of a command culture that had been structured, from Patton down, to allow information to move upward without being filtered into uselessness by layers of hierarchy protecting their own assessments. The tanker with hand grenades on his lapels in the war room and the private whose radio report drove an Army decision are the same system, different ends of the same chain. And yet the system had a limit. By late August, Third Army was outrunning its fuel. The trucks, the fuel dumps, the supply routes, the physical infrastructure that fed the advance could not keep pace with a campaign moving faster than the planners had projected. Patton's formations were beginning to run dry. The operational momentum that the information advantage had helped generate was now threatening to outpace the physical capacity of the Army to sustain it. This was not an information problem. It was a logistics problem. And it was a problem that the clipboard on the field table could identify precisely but could not solve. You can measure a fuel shortage with great accuracy. You cannot create fuel by measuring it. The Third Army G3 after-action report noted the constraint directly. The pace of advance had exceeded the capacity of available transportation to maintain supply. The advance slowed. Not because the Germans stopped it, because the trucks ran out of diesel. That is the hidden cost. The system worked, the culture worked, the correction cycle worked, and the result was an advance so fast and so deep that it broke the physical limits of the supply chain built to support it. The machine was better than the infrastructure built to feed it, which is a different kind of problem than losing, but it is still a problem. Briefly, impatiently, Third Army stopped and waited for the fuel to catch up. And while it waited, the staff sections were already writing the next iteration of the after-action reports, already measuring the gaps in the system that the August campaign had exposed, already preparing the correction for the next phase. The machine did not rest. It analyzed. Paris fell on the 25th of August, 1944. 25 days after Third Army became operational, Allied planners, before the Normandy landings, had built the entire campaign timeline around a systematic, methodical advance. The supply infrastructure, the force allocation, the logistics architecture, all of it projected that reaching the German border would take the better part of a year from the beaches, perhaps longer. Third Army was on Germany's doorstep in 5 weeks, not because the plan was executed perfectly. The fuel ran out. The logistical tail buckled under a pace it had not been designed to support. Allied command disagreements consumed time that could have been spent advancing. Lucky Forward moved every 5 days, and the communications geometry shifted with it. The SCR 399 radios failed at extended range, and motorcycle couriers filled the gap. None of that is the clean version of the story. But through all of it, through the fuel shortages and the equipment failures and the expanding distances and the organizational stress, Third Army's picture of the battlefield remained sharper and more current than anything the German command system on the other side of the line could produce in the same time. That asymmetry did not win the war alone, but it compressed time. And in a mobile campaign, compressing time is everything. Here is what the record shows when you add it up. Within 1 week of entering combat, Third Army restructured its entire approach to ultra-intelligence, grasping a source that had been underutilized and integrating it at the operational level in ways no other Army headquarters in the theater had implemented. Within 2 weeks, it abandoned its primary intelligence collection doctrine. the radio monitoring mission, the core function. The reason the AIS existed on paper, gone. Because the clipboard on the field table said the data was inferior and the liaison mission was producing better results. Within the same 2 weeks, detachment composition reorganized at multiple echelons, radio procedures reformed, relay stations established, operations van expanded, motorcycle courier routes formalized. Within 3 weeks, the Signal Intelligence Service had assumed responsibility for the entire Third Army Message Control Center, a consolidation that gave Patton the decision speed he needed and went further than any comparable headquarters in the theater had gone in integrating those functions. All of this while Third Army was advancing nearly 400 miles across France, not before the campaign, not after it, during it. Post-war German staff analyses, operational reviews, and accounts from officers who faced Third Army in August keep returning to the same description. The tempo was inexplicable for a formation of that size. Prepared responses produced diminishing results with each iteration. The pattern of advance seemed to change before the response to the previous pattern had been fully implemented. These are not the observations of commanders who failed to understand their profession. These are the observations of professional soldiers whose institutional correction cycle was longer than the one they were fighting. Third Army's correction cycle was measured in days. The German response cycle, the time required to identify a pattern, elevate it, approve a change, and push it down to the formations that needed to act, was measured in weeks, sometimes longer. By the time the German response arrived, Third Army had already corrected the pattern that prompted it. The Germans were always one cycle behind, not because they lacked intelligence or courage or professional competence, because building a correction cycle measured in days instead of weeks requires a specific kind of organizational culture. And that culture cannot be assembled under fire. It has to be built before the shooting starts. Third Army built theirs in England in the spring of 1944, in a headquarters that was preparing for a campaign that had not yet begun, under a commander who had believed for decades that the speed of information and the willingness to act on bad news were as important as the size of the force. The G2 memoranda started 12 days after headquarters arrived in the United Kingdom. The daily visits to frontline units were mandated before the first crossing to France. The after-action report began being compiled from the first day of operations, not the last. The clipboard on the field table was not an administrative formality. It was the weapon, the one the Germans never found a name for, the one that does not appear in the equipment lists or the order of battle or the technical intelligence summaries that surviving German staff officers compiled after the surrender. It appears in the G3 after-action report, in the AIS performance memoranda, in the signal relay logs, in the record of a decision made in less than 2 weeks to abandon an approved doctrine because the data said it was wrong. I want to pause here before the last image. The names that appear in the histories of Third Army's sweep across France are the names of generals and corps commanders and the army commander himself. Those names belong in the record. The decisions they made were real and consequential. But the information chain that made those decisions possible was held together by people whose names do not appear in the histories. The enlisted cavalrymen with 3 to 4 years of radio experience who pushed the SCR 399 sets past their rated limits when the distances exceeded design parameters. The liaison officers who sat with Division G2 staffs at midnight in requisitioned farmhouses, writing notes by lamplight. The motorcycle couriers carrying pouches across roads that may or may not have been clear. The 2 officers and 3 enlisted men in the operations van, who expanded from 1 and 1 because the volume demanded it, and the metrics said the original configuration was a bottleneck. These are the people who held the feedback chain together when the equipment failed, and the distances grew and the campaign moved faster than any planner had projected. They did not receive separate histories. But the 400 miles happened because of them as much as anyone whose name appears on a monument. Go back to the beginning. The clipboard on the field table in a requisitioned French farmhouse somewhere east of Avranches. Half-filled. A G2 memorandum. The gap between what the system is producing and what the Army commander needs, measured in real time on the first day of operations. That object, that half-filled form, grease-stained, written under pressure, filed immediately, is the most accurate description of what Third Army's invisible weapon actually looked like. Not a tank, not a radio, not a map. A document that asked, every single day, what did we miss, and how do we fix it before tomorrow? Post-war German staff analyses could describe the effect with precision. The tempo, the inexplicable shifts, the responses that arrived one cycle too late. What they could not describe, what does not appear in any German operational review of the summer of 1944, is the half-filled clipboard. Because you cannot see a correction cycle from the outside, you can only feel it, in the advance that does not stop, in the pattern that changes before you have finished responding to the last one. In the army that arrives at the German border 5 weeks after Allied planners said it would take a year, the Germans filed their reports. They wrote, no discernible pattern. They were right, in the way they meant it. The pattern was the absence of a fixed pattern. The pattern was the clipboard, filled a little more each day, measuring, correcting, moving forward.